Denise Colfax ran a 22-ton cement truck across my 6-ton bridge and waved at me like she owned the creek. She'd already forged an easement with a revoked engineer's signature. I recognized the name before she finished handing it to me. What she didn't know was that I'd sat on the board that pulled his license years ago, and I wasn't about to say a word about it yet. I just nodded, took the paper, and let her drive on. People think silence means you've been beaten. It doesn't. Sometimes it means you've already seen the shape of the collapse, and you're simply waiting for the last piece to fall into place. I'd spent 34 years reading bridges for a living. I knew exactly how many crossings this one had left before the math stopped forgiving her. She thought she was getting away with something. She was actually building the case against herself, one overloaded truck at a time. If you already know someone is standing on a structure about to give out beneath them, do you warn them, or do you let the weight finish the sentence they started? Retirement didn't slow me down. It just changed what I measured. Most mornings I was up before 6, walking the fence line with a thermos of black coffee, checking the creek level, checking the bridge deck for anything the winter frost might have shifted overnight. 34 years with the Ohio Department of Transportation teaches you that structures don't fail all at once. They fail in small, quiet increments that most people never bother to notice. I noticed. It was never a job to me. It was a habit that outlived the paycheck. My wife used to tease me for keeping a logbook on a bridge nobody else thought twice about. I kept it anyway. Deck temperature, rivet condition, the sound the planks made under a loaded truck, even the ones that had no business being there in the first place. My son Marcus, an engineer himself now down in Columbus, used to roll his eyes at my notebooks until the day one of them saved a client's foundation from a lawsuit. After that, he started keeping his own. I wasn't a man who went looking for conflict. Neighbors will tell you I was the one who fixed fences instead of arguing over them, who lent tools before anyone asked twice. But there's a difference between being agreeable and being blind. I'd spent my whole career watching what happens when people ignore small warning signs because confronting them felt inconvenient. Bridges don't collapse because of the first crack. They collapse because everyone decided the first crack wasn't worth mentioning. So when the trucks started crossing, I didn't overreact. I just started writing things down again, the way I always had, long before Denise Colfax ever parked her Escalade at the end of my driveway. Isn't it strange how the quietest habits, the ones nobody respects until it's too late, are usually the ones that end up saving everything? There's a rule I carried with me through 34 years of bridge inspections, long before Denise Colfax ever existed to me. Never react to the crack, react to the pattern. A single overloaded truck could be an honest mistake, a driver who took a wrong turn, a foreman who misread a weight limit sign, a one-time lapse in judgment. I'd seen good people make that kind of error and correct it the moment you pointed it out. I never went looking for a fight with someone who was simply careless once. But I'd also seen the other kind, the ones who didn't make mistakes so much as decisions, over and over, each one a little bolder than the last, because nobody had stopped them yet. Those were the people who needed more than a conversation. They needed a record. Because if you confront that kind of person too early, with too little proof, all you do is teach them how to hide the next violation better. You don't win against someone who lies for a living by catching them once. You win by letting them lie enough times that the lies start contradicting each other. That was the discipline I brought home from the state job, whether I wanted to or not. When you rate a bridge's load capacity, you don't just look at what it's carrying today. You look at what it carried yesterday, what stress accumulated in the joints nobody sees, what fatigue built up in silence, long before the deck ever gave a visible sign of trouble. People are the same way. The ones who abuse power rarely announce it in one clean, punishable sentence. They test the water, retreat if challenged, advance if ignored. My job, the only job that mattered right then, was to make sure I wasn't the one who let them advance without consequence. So I made myself a private promise the day Denise handed me that forged easement. I would not accuse her of a single thing until she had proven, in her own actions and her own words, that this was never a mistake to begin with. Not out of mercy, out of precision. A man who spent his career testifying about structural failure learns not to guess. He learns to wait for the evidence to become undeniable, and then to let it speak for itself, loud enough that no one, not her lawyer, not her brother, not the county board, could ever call it a misunderstanding. I wasn't protecting her by waiting. I was protecting the truth from ever being disputed. If patience looks like weakness to the person testing you, isn't that exactly the moment your patience is doing its most dangerous work? What was actually at stake was bigger than a bridge, and I knew it from the first week. My grandfather built that crossing with his own hands in 1958, back when Miller Creek Road was still gravel and the nearest engineer was 40 miles away. He'd done the math on paper, by hand, and got it right. 6 tons, safely rated, standing through 60-plus years of Ohio winters without so much as a cracked plank until now. That bridge wasn't sentimental to me in some soft, nostalgic way. It was proof. Proof that things built correctly, by people who respected the numbers, could outlast everyone who doubted them. Denise wasn't just risking a truck. She was risking the lives of the men driving those trucks, unaware their route had been rerouted off the county's legal, bonded haul road and onto a private structure that had never been engineered for their weight. Every trip across added stress to gusset plates that had already taken more fatigue than any inspection report would tolerate. If that bridge went down under a loaded mixer, it wasn't going to be a paperwork problem. It was going to be a funeral, and there was more beneath the surface than even I understood yet. Phase 2 of Meadowbrook Estates was creeping toward completion on a subsidence zone nobody outside her brother's company had bothered to disclose. Old mine tunnels running under half the lots she'd already sold to families with children, families who trusted a glossy brochure over a geological survey they were never shown. If Denise could forge a licensed engineer's signature to save $200,000 on a haul route, what else had she buried to keep Phase 2 moving? That was the real stake. Not my bridge, not my pride. The people about to move their families onto ground that might not hold, guided there by a woman who'd already proven she'd falsify anything standing between her and a closing date. I wasn't documenting a property dispute anymore. I was building a record that might save lives nobody else knew were in danger yet. The first real sign came on a Thursday, and it wasn't the truck. It was the paperwork. I'd asked Denise, politely, for a copy of the easement she claimed gave Meadowbrook's contractors the right to cross my property. She handed it over without hesitation, almost proudly, like she'd anticipated the question and prepared for it. That confidence should have told me everything. People who are bluffing usually flinch when you ask for proof. People who've already rehearsed the lie hand it to you like a business card. I recognized the notary seal before I even read the name attached to it. I'd seen that exact seal on a dozen documents years earlier, back when I sat on the state's professional licensing review board. The engineer who'd stamped this easement had his license revoked in 2019 for falsifying load certifications on a commercial project 2 counties over. I remembered the case specifically because it was the only time in my career I'd watched a man cry in front of a review panel and still lose everything he'd built his name on. Denise either didn't know that or didn't care. Neither option made her look better. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and did what I always did when a structure started showing me more than one kind of crack. I stopped looking at the incident in front of me and started looking for the pattern behind it. A forged easement isn't a spontaneous act. Someone has to know who to call, how much to pay, what a real seal looks like well enough to fake one convincingly. That kind of forgery doesn't happen once. It happens because it's worked before, quietly, on other projects, other landowners who either didn't check or didn't have the background to catch it. I started asking around the county, not accusing anyone, just asking, the way a retired man with time on his hands is allowed to ask things. 2 other landowners along the proposed haul route mentioned they'd been approached with temporary access agreements that sounded suspiciously similar. Neither of them had signed. Both said Denise's brother's company had moved on without them, no explanation given. That's when I understood I wasn't dealing with one bad decision about one bridge. I was looking at a method, a way of operating that treated forged paperwork and quiet pressure as standard business practice, not a desperate one-time shortcut. I didn't confront her that week. I bought a small notebook instead, the kind I used to carry on inspection sites, and wrote down every name, every date, every detail I could verify. Somewhere underneath all that confidence, Denise Colfax had already made her first real mistake. She'd shown me exactly how she operated before she ever needed to. How many people get away with the same lie for years simply because the first person who noticed it decided it wasn't worth the trouble to check? And how much more dangerous does a bluff become once nobody has ever called it? I had every reason to march down to Denise's house that week and lay the forged easement on her kitchen counter. I had the revoked license number. I had 2 neighbors willing to confirm the pattern. By any normal measure, that was enough to end this immediately. A phone call to the county, a certified letter, a lawyer's name attached to a cease and desist. It would have felt good, honestly. There's a particular satisfaction in catching someone red-handed and telling them so to their face. I didn't do it. Partly because I've learned that people caught early rarely correct themselves. They just learn to cover their tracks better the second time. A forged document exposed too soon becomes a misunderstanding she blames on a contractor, a middleman, anyone but herself. Denise struck me as exactly the type who'd have an explanation ready before I finished my sentence, and once she knew I was watching, she'd stop leaving the kind of evidence I actually needed. So instead of confronting her, I gave her something smaller, an opening, not an accusation. I stopped her in the driveway one afternoon while a truck idled behind her Escalade and said, plainly, "Denise, I think you should double-check that paperwork before another truck crosses my bridge." I'd hate for this to become bigger than it needs to be. No threats, no mention of the revoked license, just a door left open for her to walk back through, if she wanted to. She smiled at me the way you smile at someone you've already decided doesn't matter. "The easement's handled, Walt. You don't need to worry about the legal side." Then she got back in her Escalade and waved the next truck through. I stood there a long moment after she drove off, and something in me went very still and very clear. She'd had her chance to pause, to ask a single honest question about her own paperwork, and she'd chosen bravado instead. That told me more than the forged seal ever could. A person who checks their facts when challenged is careless. A person who doubles down when challenged is something else entirely. I went back inside and started my notebook's second page. Was I protecting her by giving her that warning? Or was I simply making sure that whatever came next could never be blamed on my silence? After that afternoon in the driveway, the trucks didn't slow down. They multiplied. What had started as a handful of test crossings became a routine. 2, sometimes 3 loaded mixers a day, rolling across a bridge that had never been rated for a fraction of their weight. I stood at my kitchen window and counted them the way I used to count fatigue cycles on a load chart, not with alarm, but with the cold attentiveness of a man watching a number climb toward a threshold he already knew by heart. Underneath the bridge, the evidence was writing itself. I crawled down there most mornings before the first truck arrived, flashlight in hand, and watched the damage accumulate in real time. Hairline cracks at the gusset plates that hadn't existed 3 weeks earlier. Rivets bent just slightly out of true. Deck planks beginning to splinter at the edges where a truck's rear axle dragged across them. My grandfather's steel was strong, but strong isn't the same as infinite, and Denise was spending down 60 years of margin like she'd never have to answer for it. I called Marcus that week and told him what I was seeing. He didn't ask why I hadn't already put a stop to it. He knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't collecting cracks out of curiosity. I was building a record no engineer, no lawyer, and no county board could argue with later. "Send me photos," he said. "Time-stamped. Every one." I already had 200 of them. Denise, meanwhile, had no idea the structure she was so casually driving her profits across was quietly becoming the most detailed piece of evidence in the case against her. Every truck that crossed wasn't just weight on my grandfather's steel. It was another entry in a ledger she didn't know I was keeping, and one she was filling in herself, one crossing at a time. That was when I stopped just watching and started building. The first thing I installed was simple. A trail camera bolted to the old oak at the bridge approach, angled to catch the license plate and driver of every truck that crossed. Cheap, weatherproof, the kind of thing deer hunters use. Nobody questioned a retired man dressing up his own tree line. Within a week, I had time-stamped footage of every single crossing, 31 in total, Each one another nail in a coffin Denise was building without knowing it. Then I called Marcus back down from Columbus with his portable load cell, the same equipment he used on commercial job sites. We spent a Saturday morning under the deck, running numbers I already suspected but needed on paper. The bridge's real remaining capacity had dropped to roughly 3.2 tons, barely half of what my grandfather had rated it for in 1958, and nowhere close to what these mixers were putting on it. Marcus didn't sugarcoat it. One more loaded truck at the wrong angle, Dad, and this whole span could go. I already knew that. I needed him to say it out loud, in his own professional judgment, so the record wouldn't rest on my word alone. I also drove into town and requested my own file from the county recorder's office, the original 1958 permit, the last inspection report from before I retired, and a certified copy of the disciplinary ruling against the engineer whose forged signature sat on Denise's easement. None of it was hard to get. Public record. I just made sure I had it before anyone thought to make it disappear. Last, I placed a quiet call to a former colleague still working at the state DOT inspector's office and another to the county sheriff's department, simply to let them know a private bridge near Meadowbrook Estates was being used well outside its rated capacity and that I had documentation building steadily. I didn't ask them to act yet. I asked them to be aware and to be ready when I called again. None of this touched Denise directly. No confrontation, no accusation, nothing she could spin into a persecution story at the next HOA meeting. I was simply making sure that when the moment finally came, there would be nothing left for her to argue with. Only a stack of dates, numbers, and names that told the story better than I ever could. The bridge was failing quietly. So was her cover story, one photograph at a time. While I was quietly building my case, Denise was busy building her confidence. With no pushback from me since our driveway conversation, she treated my silence as surrender. The crossings increased to 4 a day. She started parking her Escalade right at the bridge approach during peak hours, waving trucks through personally like she was directing traffic at a parade. Word around Meadowbrook was that Walt Corrigan had come around on the bridge situation, that the cranky old engineer had finally accepted progress was progress. That version of events cost me something real. A neighbor 2 properties down, a widow named Ruth who'd always been friendly, stopped waving back when I drove past. She'd heard from someone at the HOA that I was holding up construction out of spite, blocking a road bonding fix that would supposedly save the whole subdivision money. I never got the chance to explain the forged easement, the revoked license, the actual math on the bridge's remaining capacity. Denise had already framed the narrative, and framed it well, long before I'd said a single public word. Worse, one of the deck planks split clean through under a mixer's rear axle that Thursday, and instead of alarm, all it produced was a work order. Denise's brother's company sent 2 laborers out with plywood and lag bolts to patch it over the same afternoon, restoring just enough integrity to keep the trucks moving without addressing a single underlying crack. I watched them nail plywood over a structural fatigue point like they were covering a hole in a fence, and I said nothing. Because interrupting them now, before Marcus's numbers were fully documented, before the DOT and sheriff's office had enough to act on, would have cost me the one thing I couldn't replace, the element of surprise. How much easier is it to keep making the same mistake when the person who could stop you looks like he's already given up? The moment I'd been waiting for came at the Meadowbrook HOA's monthly meeting, the one held in the half-finished clubhouse with folding chairs and a coffee urn nobody had cleaned since the groundbreaking. I hadn't planned to attend. Ruth mentioned it in passing, half apologetic, and I decided a quiet man in the back row might hear something worth hearing. Denise ran that meeting like a woman who'd never once been questioned in her life. She stood at the front with a laser pointer and a rendering of Phase 2, talking about unprecedented community growth and minor logistical adjustments to the construction route. Someone near the front, a new homeowner, young, still trusting, raised a hand and asked, politely, whether the Hall Road change had been approved by the county. Denise didn't miss a beat. "I don't need the county's permission to manage private access on private property," she said, loud enough for the whole room. "That bridge crosses land under an HOA easement, and frankly, some people around here need to understand that community progress doesn't wait for one man's personal feelings about his backyard. A few people laughed. Not unkindly, just the easy laugh of people who trusted her completely and had no reason yet to doubt a word she said. I didn't stand up. I didn't correct her. I sat in the back row with my hands folded and let every word land exactly where it would matter most, recorded, word for word, in the official meeting minutes the HOA secretary was typing 3 feet in front of her. Denise Colfax had just told a room full of witnesses, on the record, that she believed she held authority she'd never legally had, over an easement that didn't exist, using a license that had been revoked 7 years earlier. She thought she'd just put an old engineer in his place. She'd actually just handed me the single cleanest piece of self-incrimination I could have asked for, in her own voice, in front of a dozen neighbors, typed into an official record she couldn't later claim was taken out of context. I finished my coffee, thanked the secretary for a well-run meeting, and drove home. Within a week, the scale of things I'd been documenting in a private notebook turned into something with its own institutional weight. Denise, riding high off the HOA meeting, brought in reinforcements. Her brother's development company hired a private security contractor to monitor the bridge approach, ostensibly to protect construction equipment, but really, as I later learned, to discourage anyone from filming or measuring the crossings too closely. 2 men in unmarked polos started parking a pickup near the oak tree where my trail camera sat, close enough to make me wonder for a night or two whether they'd noticed it. They hadn't. They were watching the road, not the tree 8 feet above their heads. At the same time, Denise brought the HOA's attorney into the picture, a younger man named Trevor Hastings, who clearly hadn't been given the full story. He sent me a certified letter citing an established right-of-way and threatening a nuisance claim if I continued to interfere with legitimate community development. I read it twice, filed it in the same folder as everything else, and didn't respond. A threatening letter built on a forged document isn't leverage. It's evidence that the forgery had now been laundered through a licensed attorney who trusted his client's paperwork without checking it. Her brother, meanwhile, made the mistake of getting personally involved. He showed up one afternoon in a company truck, introduced himself as Denise's brother, the developer, and offered me $8,000, cash, for what he called an inconvenient settlement tied to bridge access, an offer made verbally, in front of one of his own laborers, who I later learned was uneasy enough about it to mention it to a friend at the county planning office. Bribing a landowner to look past overweight crossings on a bridge you know is failing isn't a gray area. It's a confession dressed up as generosity. Each new player Denise pulled in, the security contractor, the attorney, her brother, widened the circle of people who now had some piece of the truth in their hands, whether they realized it or not. The laborer who mentioned the cash offer, the secretary who'd typed Denise's own words into the HOA minutes, the attorney who'd unknowingly sent a threatening letter built on forged paperwork. None of them were on my side exactly, but every one of them was now a thread the whole story could eventually be pulled through. I kept my 2 DOT and Sheriff's Department contacts updated with copies of everything: the letter, the notebook entries, the load cell data Marcus had gathered, the meeting minutes. Nobody moved yet. They didn't need to. The moment for that hadn't arrived. But I could feel the shape of the thing solidifying now, the way a bridge design finally stops being lines on paper and starts being something that could actually hold weight. Denise thought she was building a fortress around her position. She was really just adding more witnesses to the eventual demolition. How many people have to unknowingly become witnesses before a lie finally runs out of places left to hide? The laborer who'd overheard the cash offer had a name: Danny Ruiz, 26 years old, 2 years into a job he badly needed to keep. He found me one evening at the gas station off Route 9, hovering near my truck like he wasn't sure whether to speak at all. "Mr. Corrigan," he said, keeping his voice low even though nobody else was around. "I'm not trying to get involved in anything. I heard what Denise's brother offered you, and I've seen the geological report." That single sentence told me more than 3 weeks of surveillance had. There was a geological report. Someone had commissioned it, someone had read it, and someone, likely more than one person, had decided burying it was easier than dealing with what it said. I asked him, carefully, what was in it. He shook his head fast. I can't. I need this job. I've got a kid starting kindergarten in the fall. He wasn't lying about being scared, and he wasn't wrong to be. Men like Denise's brother didn't build subdivisions by being gentle with people who threatened their timelines. Danny wasn't protecting Denise. He was protecting his own family's rent money, and I understood that calculation better than he probably realized. I didn't push. I thanked him for what little he'd told me, gave him my number, and told him the offer to talk stood whenever he was ready. No pressure, no obligation. He nodded and drove off, looking like a man who'd just set down a weight he'd been carrying for weeks. I sat in my truck a long time after that. Danny wasn't a villain in any of this. He was just a young father caught between a paycheck and a conscience, hoping someone else would be brave enough to act first so he wouldn't have to. I'd met 100 people like him over the years. Good people, quietly aware something was wrong, waiting for permission to say so out loud. I made a note of his name in my folder, not as a witness yet, but as a door I might need to knock on later, gently, when the stakes for him were lower than they were tonight. How many truths stay buried for years, not because no one knows them, but because the first person to know them is too afraid to be the only one who speaks. Marcus called me on a Tuesday morning with a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy, trying to explain a dented fender. Dad, I ran the numbers again with last week's photos. We don't have weeks left. We might not have days. The fatigue cracking at the gusset plates had accelerated faster than either of us expected. What should have degraded gradually over months had jumped in the last 10 days alone. The plywood patch job Denise's crew slapped over the split-deck plank had shifted the load path just enough to concentrate stress somewhere the original design never intended it to go. Marcus's revised estimate put the bridge's true capacity closer to 2.8 tons now, dropping fast, with no way to know exactly which crossing would be the one that finally exceeded it. That put me in a position I hadn't planned for. My evidence file was strong. The meeting minutes, the bribery attempt, Danny's fragment about the geological report, 31 days of time-stamped truck crossings, Marcus's load data. But it wasn't complete. I still didn't have the geological survey itself. Still didn't have documented proof of the road bonding fraud I suspected was funding all of this. Still hadn't closed the loop connecting Denise's forged easement to her brother's company in a way a prosecutor could use cleanly. And now the bridge itself was telling me I might not get the luxury of finishing that work before something catastrophic happened underneath a live truck. I had two options, and I turned them over all that afternoon standing on the deck, feeling the give in the boards under my own boots. I could go public immediately with what I had. Enough, probably, to shut the crossings down, but likely to let Denise, her brother, and their attorney spin it as an overzealous neighbor's grudge, buying time to shred whatever paperwork still existed. Or I could accept the risk one more day, engineer a controlled failure precisely where and when I chose it, on my terms, with a truck I could guarantee wouldn't actually go into the creek. There was no version of patience left that didn't carry some danger now. The math had caught up with both of us, Denise and me, at exactly the same moment, for entirely different reasons. I called Marcus back that evening and told him what I needed him to help me build. He didn't hesitate. I'll bring the shear pin specs down myself, he said. Let's finish this the right way. Isn't it strange how patience and danger can arrive at the exact same threshold, forcing the very people who've been most careful to finally take the biggest risk of all? The missing piece arrived 3 days later, and it didn't come from where I expected. Danny Ruiz called me himself this time. No hesitation in his voice at all. I found a copy of that geological report, he said. Someone left it in the site trailer's recycling bin, if you can believe that. I think one of the surveyors printed it and got told to shred it, and just didn't. He photographed all 41 pages on his phone before his shift ended and sent them to me that night, along with a short, shaking message. I can't testify to this, but you can have it. I read it at my kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning. It was worse than I'd guessed. The survey, commissioned 8 months earlier by an independent geotechnical firm, documented active subsidence beneath 11 of the 18 planned Phase 2 lots, old mine tunnels from the 1940s, never properly backfilled, with soil stability ratings that should have stopped construction outright. The report's cover letter was addressed directly to Denise's brother. A handwritten note in the margin, in ink that matched nothing else in the document, read simply, "Bury this. Proceed as planned." I sat with that sentence a long time. 3 words, in someone's own handwriting, that turned an engineering oversight into something closer to a conspiracy, one that stretched from a forged bridge easement all the way down to homes already sold, to families who had no idea the ground beneath their children's bedrooms had been flagged as unsafe 8 months before they signed their mortgage papers. That same week, the road bonding fraud I'd suspected finally surfaced too. A friend at the county clerk's office, going through public filings I'd asked her to double-check, found that the bonding fees Denise had collected from homeowners, money legally required to go toward county road maintenance for construction traffic, had never actually been filed with the county at all. Nearly $200,000, sitting somewhere outside any account the county could trace, exactly matching the amount she'd have owed if she'd used the legal haul route instead of my bridge. Forgery. Bribery. A buried safety report with somebody's handwriting on it. Missing bond money. 31 days of overweight crossings on a bridge, rated for a sixth of what it was carrying. I laid it all out across my kitchen table that night. Photographs, meeting minutes, load data, the survey, the bonding records. And for the first time since this began, I could see the whole shape of it clearly, the way you finally see a structure's full failure pattern once every measurement is in front of you at once. Denise Colfax hadn't just cut a corner on a bridge. She'd built an entire structure of lies, load-bearing on nothing but the assumption that no one would ever check. How much does a single buried report weigh, once it finally surfaces, and every family who trusted a smiling HOA president has to ask what else they were never told? Everything I'd built nearly came apart the very next morning. I woke to find a county code enforcement notice taped to my own front door. Not Denise's. Mine. It cited me for unauthorized structural modification of a shared access crossing and obstruction of legitimate development traffic, with a fine attached and a hearing date set for the following week. I stood on my porch in the cold reading it twice, and it took me a moment to understand what had actually happened. Trevor Hastings, the HOA's attorney, had filed a complaint against me directly with the county, using Denise's forged easement as the supporting document, arguing that my bridge was a shared community asset and that any interference with its use, including, absurdly, my own trail camera and load monitoring equipment, constituted harassment of Meadowbrook residents. Someone had gotten to the county office before I had. Worse than the notice itself was what it did in the neighborhood. By that afternoon, word had spread through Meadowbrook that the old engineer down the road was under investigation by the county for blocking development. Not the other way around. Ruth stopped waving at me entirely now. A woman I'd never met left a note in my mailbox suggesting I let the neighborhood move forward instead of holding a grudge over an old bridge. Denise, for her part, posted an update in the HOA's community app that evening, cheerful and gracious, saying she hoped this could be resolved amicably and that she understood change was hard for some longtime residents. 43 people reacted with supportive emojis. Not one of them knew what I actually had sitting in a folder on my kitchen table. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to real doubt. Not about the facts. Marcus's numbers didn't lie. The geological report didn't lie. The meeting minutes recorded in Denise's own words didn't lie. But about whether any of it would matter if the county had already been maneuvered into treating me as the problem before I ever got a chance to present a single page of it. A hearing date, a public notice, a neighborhood turned against me by a woman who hadn't yet answered for anything. It was, for a moment, a convincing performance of victory. I called my old contact at the DOT inspector's office that night, and even he sounded more cautious than before, mentioning that political noise around the case meant they needed something more concrete before stepping in publicly. I understood what he meant. Concrete meant undeniable. Concrete meant a moment nobody in that county could spin, dismiss, or bury in a community app post. I sat alone in my kitchen that night with the code enforcement notice next to Marcus's load data, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, I genuinely didn't know if patience had cost me the window I needed. I still had one card left to play. I just wasn't certain anymore whether I'd have the chance to play it before Denise's version of events became the only version anyone believed. How much does it cost a good man to hold his silence one day longer, when everyone around him has already decided he's the villain of a story he hasn't even told yet? What kept me steady that night wasn't strategy. It was my grandfather's handwriting. I went down to the basement and pulled out the old cedar box where I kept his original bridge drawings, pencil on drafting paper, yellowed at the corners, dated 1958. He'd built that crossing the year my father was born, back when a young family with no money and no connections had to prove, on paper, that what they built would hold. He didn't have a state license review board looking over his shoulder. He didn't have a load cell or a computer model. He had a slide rule, 60 years of steel prices to worry about, and a stubborn refusal to sign his name to anything he wasn't certain would stand. I found the note he'd written in the margin of his original calculations, something I hadn't looked at in years. Built to hold what's asked of it, not what's convenient to claim. I sat there a long while with that sentence. That bridge had never failed anyone in 68 years. Not once. Not through floods, not through winters that cracked concrete 2 counties over. Not through decades of ordinary farm traffic. It was never even meant to carry that heavy. It had only started failing now, under the weight of somebody else's convenience. Somebody who'd never once asked what the structure could actually hold before deciding what she needed it to hold for her. I thought about Danny Ruiz's daughter starting kindergarten in the fall, about the 11 lots sitting over mine's subsidence with families already moved in, about the $200,000 in bonding money that had vanished into an account nobody could trace. This was never really about my bridge, and it hadn't been for a while now. It was about whether the people who built things honestly, my grandfather, myself, Marcus, even scared young men like Danny, still mattered more than the people who simply claimed authority loudly enough that everyone assumed it was real. I closed the cedar box, set my grandfather's drawings beside Marcus's load data, and made my decision. The county's hearing date could come. Denise's community post could stay pinned at the top of the app. None of it changed what was true, and none of it would matter once the truth was finally allowed to speak for itself, in the one place it couldn't be edited or explained away. Tuesday morning came in gray and still, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate. I'd called my DOT contact and the sheriff's department 2 days earlier, told them everything was ready, and asked them to stage half a mile down the road, out of sight, but close enough to arrive within 90 seconds of my call. Marcus drove down from Columbus the night before and spent 6 hours under the deck with me, installing the shear pin exactly where the math said it needed to sit, at the central load transfer point, engineered to fail cleanly at a threshold well above the posted limit, safely below anything that would send the deck into the creek. My father's safety cables, added back in the 70s, were still sound. I'd checked them myself 3 times. The truck would drop 12 inches and stop, nothing more. At 8:40 a.m., a fully loaded 22-ton mixer rolled onto the bridge, exactly on the schedule Denise's brother's company had been running for 2 months. The trail camera caught it clean. The hidden load sensors under the deck caught it clean. 3/4 of the way across, the pin sheared precisely as Marcus had calculated. The deck dropped, the cables caught, and the truck stopped dead. The driver shaken, unhurt, staring out his window at a 12-inch gap, where solid ground had been a second earlier. Denise's Escalade came around the bend within 4 minutes. I'd expected that. What I hadn't fully prepared for was how fast the sheriff's cruisers followed her in. I'd made the call the moment the pin sheared, and they'd clearly been closer than half a mile. She got out of the Escalade already talking, already performing for whatever audience she assumed would be watching. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, loud enough for the deputies to hear, jabbing a finger toward the sagging deck. "He sabotaged this bridge. This is criminal mischief, Walt, and I want him arrested right now." I let her finish. I always let people finish. Then I opened the folder I'd been carrying since sunrise and handed the lead deputy the first page. "This is a certified copy of the disciplinary ruling against the engineer who signed Ms. Colfax's easement," I said. His license was revoked in 2019 for falsifying load certifications. I sat on the board that pulled it. The deputy's expression shifted immediately. I handed over the second page. This is the county recorder's confirmation that no legal easement for commercial haul traffic exists on this property. Ever. Denise started to say something. I kept going. Third page. Marcus's certified load assessment, dated and signed, documenting the bridge's real capacity had dropped to 3.2 tons before this morning's crossing, based on 31 documented overweight crossings in 8 weeks. Fourth, the trail camera log, every date and license plate, cross-referenced against the load data. Fifth, the HOA meeting minutes, typed by their own secretary, quoting Denise word for word, claiming she didn't need county permission and calling my concerns personal feelings in front of a room full of witnesses. Sixth, Danny Ruiz's photographs of the buried geological survey, the handwritten note reading, "Bury this, proceed as planned," still visible in the scanned margin. Seventh, the county clerk's confirmation that nearly $200,000 in road bonding fees collected from Meadowbrook homeowners had never been filed with the county at all. "There's more," I said, "but I imagine that's enough to start with." The color had gone out of Denise's face by the fourth page. By the seventh, she wasn't performing for anyone anymore. "That report was preliminary," she said, weaker now. "It hadn't been verified. It's dated 8 months ago," I said. "Your brother's name is on the cover letter. You've sold 11 of those lots since then." One of the deputies was already on his radio, requesting backup and a records unit. The other asked Denise to step away from the vehicle. She looked at Trevor Hastings's certified letter, still folded in my folder, and understood, I watched it land on her face in real time, that her own attorney had unknowingly built part of the case against her, that every threat she'd made, every meeting she'd dominated, every truck she'd waved through personally on camera, had simply been another page in a file she'd never known existed until it was already closed. "You could have said something," she said, and there was real fury in it now, the anger of someone realizing too late that patience and weakness had never been the same thing. "Weeks ago, why didn't you just say something?" "I did," I said. "In the driveway, the first week. I told you to double-check that paperwork before another truck crossed my bridge. You told me it was handled." I closed the folder. It wasn't handled. It just wasn't caught yet. She was arrested on the spot. Forgery, criminal mischief, reckless endangerment, the deputy reading each charge like he was checking items off Marcus's load chart. Her brother was picked up by county detectives that same afternoon, the geological report and missing bonding money handed directly to the district attorney's office, along with everything I'd gathered. Phase 2 construction was halted within the week, once the subsidence findings went public, and 11 families learned exactly what had been buried 8 months before their closing dates. I stood at the edge of my grandfather's bridge as they led Denise to the cruiser, the deck still sagging gently against the cables that had done exactly what my father built them to do 50 years ago. Nobody had gotten hurt. Nobody ever needed to. The only thing that had actually broken that morning was a story Denise Colfax had been telling everyone, including herself, for 2 months straight. Isn't it strange how the loudest people, so certain no one is checking, are usually the ones leaving the clearest record of exactly what they did? Marcus and I rebuilt the bridge that spring, and we did it the same way my grandfather had, carefully, honestly, keeping every piece of the original steel frame that still had good life left in it. We replaced the fatigued gusset plates, reinforced the deck, and left the old cables exactly where my father had installed them 50 years earlier, because they'd done their job perfectly when it mattered most. It felt right to build the new work around what had already proven itself, rather than tearing everything down and starting over just because part of it had been tested hard. Denise pleaded out eventually. Forgery, criminal mischief, and reckless endangerment, 3 years with restitution, ordered to both the county and the homeowners whose bonding fees had vanished. Her brother's company faced federal fraud charges tied to the buried geological survey, and the $200,000 in missing bonding money became just one line item in a much larger financial mess investigators were still untangling months later. Phase 2 of Meadowbrook Estates was shut down permanently. The 11 families already living over the subsidence zone were relocated at the developer's expense, under a court order nobody was inclined to argue with once the report became public record. Danny Ruiz kept his job. I made sure of that personally, sitting with the new site manager and explaining exactly what his photographs had meant to the case, without ever making him testify to anything he hadn't already been brave enough to hand me on his own. His daughter started kindergarten that fall, same as planned, and he waved at me now every time he drove past. No longer nervous, no longer looking over his shoulder. Ruth apologized for the cold shoulder, more than once, more than she needed to. I told her there was nothing to forgive. She'd only believed what she'd been shown, same as everyone else in Meadowbrook, until the whole picture was finally allowed into the light. We put a new plaque on the bridge that June, small, simple, bolted into the same post my grandfather had used for the original in 1958. It reads, "Built 1958. Still standing, because the math doesn't lie." I think about that phrase more than I expected to, not just as an engineer's line, but as something closer to a life lesson I'd apparently been living by long before I ever needed it to matter this much. You don't beat a liar by shouting louder than they do. You beat them by being patient enough, careful enough, and honest enough that when the moment finally comes, the truth doesn't need your help standing up on its own. If you already know someone is building their own downfall one overconfident step at a time, is silence really surrender? Or is it simply the last, quietest form of justice, waiting patiently for its turn to speak? But here's what this story was really about. It was never really about a bridge. My grandfather's steel would have held for another 60 years if the right people had simply respected what it was rated for. What actually broke down here was something quieter. The assumption that a title, a board seat, a nice car in the driveway, translates into a kind of authority it never actually carries. Denise didn't wake up one morning and decide to forge a license or bury a safety report. She started with one small overstep she'd convinced herself was harmless. A shortcut, a convenience. And when nobody stopped her the first time, she stopped being able to tell the difference between managing a community and owning it. That's usually how it goes. Not one dramatic decision, but 100 small ones, each a little easier to justify than the last, because the person making them has stopped checking whether anyone's still watching. Her mistake wasn't cruelty, it was certainty. She was certain no one would read the paperwork closely enough to notice a revoked signature. Certain a meeting room full of neighbors would take her word over a quiet man's math. Certain that silence meant she'd already won. She mistook my patience for permission, and that's the mistake that ends most stories like this one. Not getting caught doing something wrong, but never once considering that someone might actually be paying attention. I didn't win because I was louder in that driveway, or angrier at that meeting. I won because I understood what she never bothered to learn, that a record built slowly, honestly, and without emotion is harder to argue with than any accusation shouted in the moment. Every truck she waved through became a data point. Every word she said in that meeting became a transcript. She built the case against herself, one confident decision at a time, and all I had to do was resist the urge to stop her before the pattern was complete. Most people have met a version of Denise, maybe not with an Escalade and an HOA gavel. Maybe it was a manager who confused a title with ownership of the people beneath them, a relative who mistook family loyalty for permission to control everyone around them, a small office where one person decided the rules applied to everyone except themselves. The setting changes. The behavior rarely does. And the real danger was never the person overstepping. It was how many of us go quiet just to avoid the discomfort of confronting it early. If someone used rules against you the way Denise used hers, would you fight the moment you noticed, or wait until the record was too complete to argue with?